Tribune. It's headlining Spain's change of government, reporting that voters have punished the Socialist Party. It says Spaniards are hoping the Conservative Popular Party will help ease the pain of the debt crisis. The EU debt crisis is also making headlines in the Financial Times. It looks at a study conducted by the European Commission that will recommend the introduction of a joint Eurobond that could replace national insurance and stabilise the sovereign debt market. The Irish Times focuses on Ireland's plan to slash child benefits by £10 a week in a bid to reduce its welfare spending bill. And the violent protests in Egypt have made the front pages of several papers, including The Independent. It reports that several demonstrators have been killed trying to dislodge the military council. And the Arab League's plans to hold new crisis talks about Syria, that's across the front page of the Gulf News, after the country refused to meet its deadline to end the violence. And the South China Morning Post is headlining Shenzhen's plans to launch an IP index. It notes that old habits die hard and that China protecting intellectual property rights is a daunting image. Plenty to discuss, of course. We're joined by Bundeep Rangar, chairman of IndusView, the business consultancy firm. Lovely to have you with us. Let's begin with Spain, because this was largely expected, but this landslide really shows just what the electorate in Europe feels, doesn't it?
Well, this is the third change in Europe in the government here, but the first one through an electoral process. But the one clear message across all three of them is it's time for a financial change, and it's out with the old and with the new. The one thing that this new government has as a daunting task is to make sure it doesn't go down the path of Portugal or Ireland or Italy and become another addition to Europe's debt crisis, which is just precariously close to.
And I suppose the question is whether or not he can convince not just his people, he's already said don't expect miracles to the electorate, but convincing external investors that Spain is a worthy investment.
And that's a really tricky one when you have a 45% unemployment rate amongst the youth population and a 22% overall, and an economy that's been built over the past decade on one big chunk of the economy, which is real estate. And as that real estate market's lost the bottom and the floor, it's become really hard to revive this economy and send the signal out to external investors, which affects one big thing for Spain, which is their borrowing rate. And that's a key figure to watch out.
One thing he has in his favour, though, doesn't he? He has quite a big majority, so that's a real help when it comes to trying to push through difficult change through Parliament, etc. But also the debt to GDP ratio is 70%, a lot lower than Italy, than the UK, than many other economies.
And as long as that can be used to get cheaper cost of borrowing and therefore fuel what's ultimately needed is growth.
Isn't it? It's not getting the cheaper cost of borrowing, is it? Because it's just, you know, the perception in the market and the speculation is driving up the Spanish bond interest rates.
Absolutely, it's closely watched numbers to what their bond rate is. And a critical thing is how do they get growth back? It's one thing to get austerity measures in with a clear electoral mandate, which is, you know, everybody agrees on, but can that then translate into growth that then helps service the interest rate on the borrowings and, of course, decreases unemployment? And that's the biggest challenge.
I mean, obviously, answers are being searched for all over, and the European Commission has published a study, or is issuing a study, looking at a joint Eurobond. Now, can you just explain, first of all, what this would do, what this means?
Okay. So
no mean feat this time in the morning.
Absolutely. Well, when countries borrow through their own issues of bonds, they're basically relying on their own credit rating to see what cost of borrowing they can get. The idea behind collaborating and creating a Eurobond is you take the weighted average cost of borrowing for all the 17 member EU countries.
This is for the Eurozone, isn't it?
For the Eurozone itself, as opposed to the 27 member European Union, and therefore get better borrowing terms so that countries like Italy, which they are getting punished for having a high cost of borrowing, benefit from the better credit rating of Germany, which has a much lower cost of borrowing. And if you take the average debt to GDP ratio, the Eurozone combined is about 85% debt to GDP ratio. Contrast that with the United States, it's about 94% debt to GDP ratio. So arguably, the Eurozone as a whole is a better borrower, a more credible borrower than the United States, and therefore should have a lower cost of borrowing.
How does that affect the individual member states within the Eurozone, though, for example? I mean, obviously, it's great news for Italy, but what about Germany? It's got a very low cost of borrowing at the moment.
And that's a challenge, right? Because why would Germany necessarily want another country to piggyback its own credit rating built on a much more sound financial system? unless there's a sense of some collective benefit to everybody out of it. Because in the short term, the German electorate will say, well, we're just paying for the wasteful habits of some other European countries and for their past mistakes, and why should we do that? So the mechanism sounds good, and there may be a halfway zone where you contribute a certain amount towards this borrowing, but you limit that to implementation of austerity measures, and of course, fiscal reform to help enable better tax collection, better growth, and that may be one halfway zone. That's one of the three proposals behind this Eurobond issue.
When it comes to austerity measures, I think it's fair that governments need to look at everything, and some of the decisions that are going to be made are going to be very, very unpopular. I mean, looking at the Irish Times today, yes, backbenchers are criticising this €10 cut, €10 cut to child benefit. It doesn't sound nice, it doesn't make good headlines, but something needs to be done, doesn't it?
And we'll see that across the Eurozone, because for too long we've been living on sort of borrowed time, if you may. And the challenge is, at what point does it get to be so costly that it costs them an election versus just something that's needed to be done to change and turn around the economy? And child welfare benefits clearly are extremely sensitive and right at the core of that.
Right, let's have a look at what's going on in Egypt. Obviously, one of the top stories today in the news, but also all over the papers. It's a tricky situation, isn't it? Because it's very reminiscent of how this all started in that square, I don't know how many months ago.
Square, yeah.
Yeah, it was earlier this year in April, I believe. So, you know, change was what people wanted, and what people have not seen is that change being implemented. And certainly the pace of reform is very slow. There's no big prosecution charges against Hosni Mubarak and kind of an outcome from that. The key security forces who were behind the earlier crackdown this year have not been charged as well. And the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been so far fairly quiet behind the scenes, has not taken an active front role to bring about some of that change. That pace, unless it accelerates, is going to defeat the whole purpose of the revolution that sparked across the Arab Springs. And the frustrations being vented out.
It's interesting how the international community is going to look at this, because it was February actually when Hosni Mubarak was toppled. But again, when you see this violence seeping through, and the balance of change now, where it seemed such a positive move at first, didn't it? And now people are going to still be observing.
You contrast that with Tunisia, where they've gone through the change and they've had an electoral process and they've brought new people in. And here in Egypt, this just hasn't happened. Right? They're maybe 10 days away from a new election, but it's just not seeing the change that the people wanted earlier this year.
We can just actually see what's going on at the moment, because there have been reports that there's been a truce. There've been earlier in the day, a few hours ago, there've been reports that intensified. The violence is intensifying. At the moment, the scene is pretty calm, but of course, we'll keep people updated. Yeah, and just to reiterate, what you're looking at there is Tahrir Square in Egypt, the scene right now.
It's a lot quieter without the army and the police out there.
It certainly is. We've got, can't ignore Syria, of course.
Now on the subject.
There's this impasse, isn't there, between the Arab League and Syria. Syria's still very defiant, despite the Arab League international condemnation as well.
And after what's happened with Gaddafi in Libya, I suspect he would be more defiant, because the consequences of being taken out with few other countries to go and seek refuge at are staring at him in the face. What this is, I guess, is in some ways increased isolation of Syria, and in many ways the Arab League now coming together and putting demands on him that he doesn't want to have met, and saying this is just a tool for the United Nations to put this as a Security Council agenda item, sort of shows where he's sort of being cornered more and more, not only internationally but also within the country. And what does someone who's very cornered do? Becomes defiant.
Yes, they become defiant, but there's the threat of economic sanctions as well. Would it have any impact?
It would, because Syria is not an oil-rich country, unlike some of its other neighbors, and therefore can't rely on wealth creation and revenue coming in through an oil economy. It is dependent on, in many ways, on foreign trade, if not foreign investment.
Very quickly, Bundeep, intellectual property rights in China, the two don't go hand in hand.
Certainly not.
It's kind of like the old Soviet Union having like a human rights index. You know, it just doesn't work that way, doesn't it? But it is at least a signal for them to say they are taking the whole idea of intellectual property and technology seriously.
The road to change, perhaps. There's a journey there.
We're all optimistic about that, but let's just say very, very, very cautious about it.
Very, very cautious. That's a very nice way of putting it, Bundeep. Thank you very much, Bundeep Rangar there from IndusView. It's always good to have you with us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Plenty more to come from Sally and myself, though. It's goodbye for now.
Bye-bye. See you soon.